Hi people, it's Coexist here, and today I want to talk about The Division 2 and Anthem, two games that I have really enjoyed. The Division 2 surprised me in fact because I wasn't even going to get it initially because I thought it looked just too bland and run-of-the-mill, but I have to say Ubisoft have surprised me with this game and I found quite a lot of enjoyment in it. And Anthem is a game where I did want to enjoy it, I did enjoy it, perhaps more than a lot of people have done, but I also see room for improvement. Thing is, right at the start here, I just want to say that these are two games that can quite easily coexist with each other. I think they offer enough to distinguish each other from themselves that any gamer, if you've got the budget of course, can quite happily own both of these titles and get something quite distinct from one another. They may both be trying to be games as a service, they may both be trying to be looter shooters, but the setting, the way the gameplay works, the narrative, these are incredibly different between the two games, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to own both of them because you will get a very distinct experience from both. Unless, however, you are the kind of person who wants to really throw themselves into these games and dedicate a lot of time to the point where you wouldn't have time to play the other. I, however, when it comes to these looter shooters, do not tend to, if I'm honest, get that far into the end game. What I usually do, and I'd be surprised if I'm alone on this, is with these looter shooters, I do tend to play through the story for a certainty. Then, if I like it, I tend to go up to the maximum available level. I then dabble a little bit in the endgame content, but it's very rare that I actually lose myself in that endgame grind because the repetition tends to just feel not too fun for me, and while I'm doing it I'm just thinking to myself, I could be playing something different at the moment and get a new experience. So that's what I've tended to do. Indeed, I did it for Destiny as well, both Destiny 1 and 2. I played through the story, got to the max level, but then didn't really do much in endgame, but I would still certainly say that I enjoyed those games. And it's what I did with Anthem as well, a game where I have to say at the moment I am sort of finished with Anthem, but that's a solid 25 hours according to Origin, although some of that would just be idle time, so maybe close to 23 hours. But those were 23 hours well spent. In Anthem, it's a case of a flawed experience. You can't get away from that, but with this really interesting premise of this world where there's been like a previous apocalypse and there's this city that's trying to guard itself from this incredibly hostile world, and they have to create javelins, these suits, to be able to fly out into the open world. And the javelins in and of themselves really do carry the game, if I'm honest. You get variety between the four main javelins, and each one looks very different and also plays very differently. And I have to say that's something that I really think Anthem does better than pretty much any looter shooter that I'm aware of, is that the classes feel super distinct. I mean, the way the Interceptor plays versus the Colossus, for example, these are very different methods of approaching Anthem. And combat is very bombastic and it's very agile. It doesn't pay to stay still. You want to keep moving, implement your flight capabilities if you need to get out of a jam. It's a very fun and frenetic arcade style which really fits the numbers flying all over the place presentation of a typical looter shooter. And I have to say I really like the combat in it. I think what let it down for me was the AI. That's the thing that probably is its weak point. The AI can be so stupid if you actually watch them do things. It's a lot like Dynasty Warriors, where if you just shoot your way through your foes and you blast them all down, you don't tend to notice it. But if you actually stop for a moment and see what are they actually trying to do, they do some weird stuff. Some just stand there, some run into walls, sometimes they just disappear. That's the weirdest thing that really annoys me. Sometimes they do just disappear out of nowhere, and it makes them feel like they're almost intangible and not worth fighting. There are also some pacing issues in the story of Anthem, but on the whole, I think it's a decent game that I think maybe after a bit of a price cut that it's worth investing your time into. And I thought with The Division 2 before I experienced it, I was not excited for The Division 2 at all. Like I say, it was something that appeared to be too generic for me. And I've also played The Division 1 to the end of the story, and I thought, what's the point? But I have to admit, The Division 2 has reminded me that a lot has to be said for a game that is quite simply well made and well put together. So if we look at some of the issues with Anthem, like loading screens being very prevalent, well, in the Division 2, you've got a world where you can go from the open environment of Washington, D.C., and then just wander into a mission area and then wander right out. You don't have to see a single loading screen unless, for example, you die, which makes the world feel very, very connected. When you're inside a mission zone, you still feel like you're in Washington, D.C. Whereas in Anthem, when you go into a cave and a loading screen pops up, it can feel like you've sort of left the world of Anthem and you're in this little box area. Also, another thing is that Anthem does not work well if you try and play it solo, which pretty much forced me to always do at least a pickup group when I was doing missions. Even though, from a story perspective, it acts very much as if you are the only one involved in the mission. It gets quite strange like that. Every now and then it will reference that you might call upon more freelancers, but a lot of the time you're being spoken to as if you're the only one there. But if you actually try and create a private lobby and play on your own, it even says that Anthem is best played with others, which at first I thought was just them trying to encourage multiple people, but the reality is if you try and play it on your own, it does get a bit weird. The difficulty doesn't feel properly calibrated to accommodate for one player. It feels like you get enemies that aren't really manageable, whereas in the Division 2 I feel as if it works equally well in co-op or on your own. In fact, the Division 2 in solo offers an extremely good challenge in my opinion. It never felt unfair, but the AI are so aggressive and will tend to flank you and have all these different abilities. Some of them will send like RCXDs at you, some of them have these shields which you can shoot off if you put enough damage on them. You've got armored enemies, you've got regular enemies, enemies that run at you like berserkers. There's all this variety and it adds up to this really complex challenge. And you can die really quickly in a Division 2, regardless of what your armor's like, because it's a game that does encourage you to stay in cover, which isn't necessarily a better thing on Anthem. That's merely a sort of a different thing. But I have to admit, whereas Anthem's combat is fun because of how agile you can feel, the Division 2 is good because of how agile, I guess, and clever and varied your enemies are. So it's kind of what your preference is there, but I have to say that because of the nuance of the Division 2's combat, it feels more refined, but there's a sort of guilty fun that Anthem presents as well. But another thing, and this is, I don't hear too many people talking about this point, but I do think, and by the way, I'm gauging this on a PC, GTX 1080 Ti, but I think the graphics in the Division 2 are more consistent. I'm not going to say better, because Anthem, I've said this before, has this thing where in direct sunlight, the game looks fantastic. But the moment you go into any kind of shade, the lighting and the shading just isn't nuanced enough. Like the ambient occlusion's bad, I don't know, but it just completely washes out the image to the point where it doesn't look good at all, and it almost feels like you've stepped back a generation. So it's like a game of extreme highs and lows, I find. Whereas the Division 2, even as the game gets darker, I find it's able to use multiple light sources to keep the dynamism of its world alive. And if you go into dark areas like rooms, there are plenty of little lights and little details, so it never feels like it's being drowned out. In fact, I've been in some rooms in Division 2 which are very atmospheric and look very good, but yeah, the Anthem is just a little bit sporadic, and I don't know if that's ever going to change because it's fundamental to the engine. And you do sometimes feel like for Division 2 the Snowdrop engine was chosen wisely for this product. In fact, I think it's the flagship title for the engine as I understand it, whereas Frostbite feels like they grabbed it because it looks so good in Battlefield and thought, well, if we use the engine that Battlefield uses, that's got to work for us, but not really taking into account that this is a very different beast and it feels like an engine that's been sort of crushed in to make it fit but doesn't quite work. In terms of story, I think in the Division 2, I have to admit it's just bland and I don't care. That's my opinion. It won't necessarily be everyone's, but these sort of Tom Clancy stories I very rarely care about. In fact, it gets to the point where I start skipping cutscenes. And then on the Anthem side, although on the face of it, it was more interesting to me, in reality, it's a bit of a case of MacGuffin plot points that make it feel really contrived and never very specific and all that very convenient and disconnected. And even, as some people have noted, where it looks like the game has sort of been re-edited into different sequences so that you're experiencing the story slightly out of order if you're really paying attention to it. So neither game is winning for story, but I also don't really care, because I think looter shooters are a genre that can get away with having a pretty poor story. Not to say that I wouldn't encourage a developer to come out and make a really good story for a looter shooter. I mean, for a long time people thought fighting games didn't need to have a good storyline, but then if you look at the most recent Mortal Kombat games, they completely upped the bar to the max and had fantastic storylines. So I feel like that's something that still hasn't quite been taken advantage of, is no one's found a way yet to make a really compelling and involved narrative in a game of this genre. But then again, maybe it truly doesn't belong, because the repetitive nature of these games means that you wouldn't want to have to experience the story each time you play a mission. You want to keep it quite lightweight so that you can be incentivized to go back and grind, because I think it's quite frustrating when you have to keep going back and watching a cutscene, but if you're just going through the motions, it's a little bit more manageable. Unfortunately, I don't have much more of a deep dive on either of these games, because I know there are lots of people out there who will dedicate lots of time to learning and understanding the nuance of this game and can do a much fairer comparison. But the point of this video was actually to say that although there are weaknesses on both sides, I think fundamentally when it comes down to it, they are good experiences. I really do believe that. I like both Anthem and I like The Division 2, and I feel like, again, so long as you have the budget and so long as you have the time to do so, it's completely makes sense to get both, because they do offer unique experiences on both sides and they distinguish themselves from one another sufficiently to warrant buying both. So, as always people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.